Imagine a place where children were kept in cages, where human beings were left to rot in their own filth, where screams echoed through corridors day and night, and no one came to help. Imagine doctors who saw intellectually disabled children not as patients to heal, but as animals to control. Staff who used restraints as punishment and isolation as entertainment. Administrators who knew about the torture and called it treatment. You don't have to imagine it. It existed for 79 years. This is Pennhurst State School and Hospital in Pennsylvania. And if you thought our story about Willowbrook was disturbing, you haven't seen anything yet. Because Pennhurst wasn't just an institution that failed its residents, it was a deliberate system of torture, hidden in plain sight, operating with full government approval, while children suffered and died behind its walls. You are watching Dreaded, and today we're exposing the nightmare that Pennsylvania tried to bury, a horror story that lasted nearly 8 decades and destroyed thousands of lives. Subscribe now, because what happened at Pennhurst will make you question everything you believe about humanity, justice, and the value of human life. The Progressive Era. America was modernizing, industrializing, embracing science and rational thinking. It was supposed to be the Age of Enlightenment. But alongside this progress came something darker, the eugenics movement. A pseudo-scientific belief that society could be improved by controlling who was allowed to reproduce, who deserved to live freely, and who should be locked away forever. And at the heart of this movement was a simple, terrible idea: that some human beings were less than human, that people with intellectual disabilities were defectives who threatened the genetic purity of the American race. Pennsylvania took this idea and built a monument to it. They called it the Eastern Pennsylvania State Institution for the Feeble-Minded and Epileptic. Later, they would rebrand it with a friendlier name, Pennhurst State School and Hospital. But names don't change what a place truly is. And Pennhurst was never a school. It was never a hospital. It was a warehouse for human beings society wanted to forget existed. Located in Spring City, Pennsylvania, about 30 miles from Philadelphia, Pennhurst opened its doors in 1908 with grand promises. It would be a self-sufficient community where people with intellectual disabilities could live, work, and receive education and care. The reality was different from the very beginning. Pennhurst was designed to house 500 residents. Within a decade, it held over 1,000. By the 1960s, that number had swelled to over 3,000 people, crammed into facilities built for a third that many. But overcrowding was just the beginning of Pennhurst's sins. What happened inside those walls over the next 79 years represents one of the darkest chapters in American history. A systematic program of abuse, neglect, and dehumanization that destroyed thousands of lives while the state of Pennsylvania looked the other way. And unlike Willowbrook, which operated for 40 years before being exposed, Pennhurst tortured people for nearly twice as long. Generation after generation of vulnerable children and adults were fed into this machine of suffering. The question isn't just how Pennhurst happened. It's how it was allowed to continue for so long, even after the truth was revealed, even after journalists documented the horror, even after courts ordered it to change. Because the real story of Pennhurst isn't about one institution's failure. It's about a society that chose to torture its most vulnerable citizens rather than treat them as human beings deserving of dignity and care. The Unfolding. Pennhurst's Descent into Hell. Chapter 1. the architecture of dehumanization. Pennhurst wasn't built to fail. It was built to warehouse human beings society wanted to forget existed, and the architecture itself was designed to dehumanize. The main building stood like a Gothic prison, imposing and institutional. Long corridors stretched endlessly, lined with locked doors, barred windows, concrete floors that could be hosed down when residents soiled themselves. Because that was the expectation from the beginning, that people with intellectual disabilities were essentially animals who needed to be contained, not human beings who deserved dignity. The residential buildings were called cottages, a pleasant word meant to evoke images of comfortable homes. But these weren't cottages. They were holding pens. Inside, the reality was nightmarish. Rows of metal cribs with cage-like tops, preventing residents from climbing out. Some of these cribs were so small that teenagers and adults were forced to sleep curled in fetal positions. Day rooms, where residents spent their waking hours, had nothing in them. No furniture, no toys, no books, just empty spaces with walls painted in institutional green or gray. Human beings sitting on concrete floors, rocking back and forth with nothing to do and nowhere to go. Bathrooms were open and communal with no privacy. Toilets lined up in rows, no stalls, no dignity. Residents were often made to use these facilities in groups, supervised by staff who treated bathroom time as an efficiency exercise rather than a basic human need. But perhaps the most telling architectural feature were the isolation rooms, windowless chambers with padded walls where residents were locked for hours, sometimes days, as punishment for behaviors that were often just expressions of frustration or fear. From the design of the place, Pennhurst communicated a clear message. The people inside were not fully human and did not deserve to be treated as such. Chapter 2. The Eugenics Machine. To understand why Pennhurst became what it was, you need to understand the ideology that created it, eugenics. In the early 20th century, prominent American scientists, doctors, and politicians believed that intellectual disability was hereditary and that allowing defectives to reproduce would weaken the human race. The solution? Institutionalization and sterilization. Pennhurst became Pennsylvania's primary dumping ground for people deemed feeble-minded, a catch-all term that included anyone with intellectual disabilities, learning difficulties, or even just behavioral problems that families couldn't handle. Children were committed to Pennhurst for reasons that seem incomprehensible today. A girl who became pregnant out of wedlock might be labeled morally defective and sent to Pennhurst. A boy who struggled in school might be diagnosed as feeble-minded and institutionalized for life. Once inside Pennhurst, many residents were sterilized without their consent or understanding. Pennsylvania had enacted a eugenics sterilization law in 1905, and Pennhurst became a major site for these forced procedures. Between 1908 and 1960, thousands of Pennhurst residents were sterilized. The procedures were performed without anesthesia in many cases. Complications were common. Deaths occurred. But the state didn't care. These people weren't supposed to reproduce anyway. If some died during the procedure, that was simply one less defective person to house and feed. The medical director of Pennhurst in the 1920s, Dr. Martin Barr, was a vocal eugenicist who wrote extensively about the need to prevent reproduction among the feeble-minded. He advocated for permanent institutionalization and sterilization, arguing that people with intellectual disabilities had no right to freedom or family. In his writings, Dr. Barr described Pennhurst residents as a burden to society and threats to racial purity. He viewed his work not as healthcare, but as social engineering, removing undesirable elements from the gene pool. This ideology permeated every aspect of Pennhurst's operations. Staff were trained to see residents not as people needing care, but as defective specimens requiring control. Abuse wasn't just tolerated, it was rationalized as necessary for managing an inherently dangerous and subhuman population. Chapter 3: Daily Life in Hell. What was it actually like to live at Pennhurst? Former residents and staff have provided testimonies that paint a picture of systematic horror. Morning would begin with mass wake-ups. Staff would walk through the dormitories, banging on beds and shouting. Residents had minutes to use the bathroom, dress, and line up for breakfast. Those who couldn't move fast enough were often beaten or dragged. Physical abuse was so common that newer staff members were shocked at first, then gradually normalized the violence that they witnessed daily. Breakfast was served in chaotic dining halls. Residents who could feed themselves were given a few minutes to eat whatever slop was provided that day. Those who needed help feeding often went hungry because staff didn't have time or didn't care to assist. After breakfast, residents were herded into day rooms where they would spend hours doing nothing. No education, no therapy, no activities, just sitting or standing in empty rooms with dozens of other people. The smell in these rooms was overwhelming. Many residents weren't toilet trained or couldn't access bathrooms when needed, so they soiled themselves. Staff would leave them sitting in their own waste for hours until the next scheduled bathroom break. Some residents spent their entire lives in these day rooms, decades of sitting in the same room, staring at the same walls, with no stimulation, no purpose, no hope. Those who acted out, who screamed from frustration or tried to leave or showed any sign of resistance, were punished brutally. They might be restrained to beds or chairs for days at a time, locked in isolation cells, beaten by staff, drugged into submission. Physical restraints were used constantly and carelessly. Residents were strapped to beds, tied to chairs, locked in straitjackets for hours or days at a time. The restraints often caused injuries, broken bones, nerve damage, deep tissue wounds. But the physical abuse was only part of the horror. The psychological torture was perhaps worse. Imagine being a child with Down syndrome, unable to fully understand why your parents brought you to this place and never came back. Imagine spending years in a room with dozens of others, never having a private moment, never feeling safe, never experiencing kindness or compassion. Imagine being a teenager with autism, your sensory sensitivities constantly overwhelmed by the noise, the smells, the chaos, with no way to escape and no one to comfort you. Imagine being an adult with cerebral palsy, intellectually intact but physically disabled, watching the abuse around you and knowing you could be next, unable to advocate for yourself or others because no one believes you're capable of rational thought. This was daily life at Pennhurst. Not for days or weeks, but for years, sometimes for entire lifetimes. Chapter 4: The Staff, Enablers and Enforcers. Who were the people who worked at Pennhurst? How did they justify participating in such systematic cruelty? The answer is complicated and disturbing. Some staff members were sadists who actively enjoyed hurting vulnerable people. They saw employment at Pennhurst as an opportunity to exercise power over those who couldn't fight back. These were the staff who would beat residents for minor infractions, who would force them into painful positions and leave them there for hours, who would sexually abuse those who couldn't report or wouldn't be believed. But they were the minority. Most staff fell into a different category: ordinary people who became numb to extraordinary suffering. Pennhurst was chronically understaffed and underfunded. Attendants were paid poverty wages, received minimal training, and were expected to manage dozens of residents with complex needs essentially alone. New employees would arrive with good intentions, wanting to help people, but they quickly discovered that helping was impossible under the conditions. There simply wasn't time or resources to provide actual care. So they adapted. They learned to see residents as less than human because seeing them as fully human while treating them so terribly would have been psychologically unbearable. They learned to ignore screams because responding to every cry for help would make the job impossible. They learned to walk past residents covered in filth because cleaning everyone properly would take hours they didn't have. They learned, in other words, to participate in a system of institutional torture while telling themselves they were just doing their jobs. Some staff did try to speak out. They reported abuse to supervisors, only to be told to mind their own business or risk losing their jobs. They documented neglect in incident reports that were buried in administrative offices and never investigated. A few even went to outside authorities, police, social workers, journalists, but were largely ignored or dismissed. Who would believe accusations of systematic abuse at a state-run facility? Surely the government wouldn't allow such things to happen. But the government not only allowed it, they funded it. State officials visited Pennhurst regularly, saw the conditions, and approved budgets that ensured those conditions would continue. The Pennsylvania Department of Public Welfare received countless reports of abuse and neglect at Pennhurst over the decades. Their response was typically to file the reports away and take no action. When particularly egregious incidents couldn't be ignored, like when residents died under suspicious circumstances, the department would conduct pro forma investigations that always concluded staff had acted appropriately given the difficult population they were managing. This institutional protection allowed abuse to flourish. Staff knew they could hurt residents with virtual impunity. Administrators knew they could ignore problems without consequences, and the cycle of torture continued year after year. Chapter 5. The Children, Pennhurst's youngest victims. If there's a particularly heinous aspect of Pennhurst history, it's what was done to children. Thousands of children were sent to Pennhurst over its 79-year existence. Some were infants, committed by parents who were told their disabled babies would receive specialized care. Others were older children whose families couldn't cope with their disabilities or behavioral issues. What these children experienced at Pennhurst was beyond comprehension. Young children were kept in cribs with cage tops, sometimes for years. They would lie in these cribs most of the day and night, developing bed sores, muscle atrophy, and profound psychological trauma. Many children at Pennhurst had relatively mild disabilities when they arrived, but the deprivation and abuse they experienced caused severe developmental regression. Children who could walk when admitted became unable to walk after months of being confined to cribs. Children who could speak stopped speaking after realizing no one would respond to their words. The lack of stimulation caused what psychologists call institutional autism. Severe developmental delays and behavioral problems caused entirely by environmental deprivation rather than inherent disability. In other words, Pennhurst took children with manageable disabilities and created severe disabilities through abuse and neglect. Sexual abuse of children at Pennhurst was rampant and systematic. Older residents, staff members, and even visitors sexually assaulted children who couldn't report the abuse or wouldn't be believed. Records show that pregnancy among adolescent female residents was common, with staff either participating in the abuse or failing to protect vulnerable children from predators. When these pregnancies occurred, the girls were typically sterilized immediately after giving birth, their babies taken away, and the incidents covered up. No investigations, no prosecutions, just more trauma heaped on children who had already endured unspeakable horrors. The psychological impact of growing up at Pennhurst was catastrophic. Children developed severe attachment disorders, PTSD, and complex trauma that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Those who were eventually released, whether as adults or through the facility's later closure, often struggled to function in the outside world. They had been so thoroughly dehumanized that rebuilding a sense of self and worth proved nearly impossible.
Chapter 6. Death at Pennhurst. Pennhurst wasn't just a place of torture. It was a place where people died in shocking numbers, under suspicious circumstances, with minimal investigation. The death rate at Pennhurst was consistently higher than comparable institutions, and vastly higher than the general population. Residents died from preventable illnesses, untreated injuries, and what can only be described as neglect-induced mortality. Pneumonia killed dozens every year, a preventable and treatable condition that became fatal because residents weren't given proper medical care. Infections from bed sores, restraint injuries, and poor hygiene claimed more lives. Some residents simply stopped eating and wasted away because they had given up hope. Others died in accidents that were only accidents in the most technical sense. Deaths that occurred because safety protocols didn't exist or weren't followed. There were drownings in bathtubs where residents were left unsupervised, choking deaths at meals where no one was watching, deaths from falls in buildings with known safety hazards that were never repaired. And then there were the deaths that couldn't be explained away as accidents or medical conditions, the residents who died with unexplained injuries, the suspicious bruises and broken bones discovered in autopsies, the patterns of trauma consistent with physical abuse. These deaths were rarely investigated thoroughly. Autopsies were cursory or not performed at all. Death certificates listed vague causes like respiratory failure or cardiac arrest without examining what caused those conditions. When families questioned how their loved ones died, they were typically given bureaucratic runarounds. Medical records were incomplete or mysteriously missing. Staff who witnessed the deaths couldn't remember details. Administrators expressed condolences but provided no real answers. Between 1908 and 1987, thousands of people died at Pennhurst. The exact number is unknown because record-keeping was poor and many deaths were never properly documented. These people were buried in a cemetery on the Pennhurst grounds, most in unmarked graves. The cemetery itself became neglected over the decades, overgrown and forgotten like the people buried there. In death as in life, Pennhurst residents were treated as less than human. Their deaths were inconveniences to be processed and forgotten, not tragedies to be mourned or investigated. The climax. When the world finally saw. The torture at Pennhurst wasn't a secret. Families knew, staff knew, state officials knew, but the public didn't. And without public pressure, nothing changed. That began to change in 1968, when NBC 10 Philadelphia reporter Bill Baldini decided to investigate rumors about conditions at Pennhurst. What he discovered would shock the nation and finally force Pennsylvania to confront the hell it had created. The broadcast that changed everything. Baldini's 5-part series, titled Suffer the Little Children, aired in October 1968. The visuals were devastating. Viewers saw naked residents lying in their own filth, children in cage cribs, rocking back and forth with vacant expressions, adults restrained to beds, some with visible injuries. The overwhelming stench was evident even through television screens. But it wasn't just the visuals that shocked audiences. It was Baldini's interviews with staff who spoke casually about conditions that any reasonable person would recognize as torture. One attendant described how residents were hosed down with cold water when they soiled themselves. Another explained the restraint procedures used as punishment. A nurse discussed the inadequate medical care with bureaucratic detachment. These weren't people confessing to crimes. They were describing their jobs, unaware that what they were revealing was systematic abuse. The public reaction was immediate and explosive. Phone calls flooded NBC 10 and Pennsylvania government offices. Letters poured into newspapers. Advocacy groups formed overnight, demanding immediate action. For the first time, ordinary Pennsylvanians saw what their tax dollars were funding. They saw the reality behind the pleasant name state school and hospital. They saw human beings treated worse than animals. And they were horrified. The legal battle began. The publicity created by Baldini's reporting opened the door for legal action. In 1974, the parents of Terry Lee Halderman, a Pennhurst resident, filed a lawsuit against the institution on behalf of all residents. The case, Halderman versus Pennhurst State School and Hospital, would become landmark litigation that fundamentally changed how America treats people with intellectual disabilities. The lawsuit alleged that conditions at Pennhurst violated residents' constitutional rights and failed to provide even minimal standards of care. The evidence presented during the trial was overwhelming and horrifying. Experts testified about the psychological damage caused by institutional deprivation. Former residents described abuse they had witnessed or experienced. Staff members, granted immunity, confessed to practices they had previously hidden. Medical records revealed patterns of injury consistent with systematic abuse. Death records showed mortality rates that couldn't be explained by the residents' disabilities alone. The defense tried to argue that Pennhurst was doing the best it could with limited resources and a difficult population. But the evidence made clear that the problems weren't about funding or population challenges. They were about a fundamental failure to recognize residents as human beings deserving of dignity. In 1977, Judge Raymond Broderick issued a devastating ruling. He found that conditions at Pennhurst violated residents' constitutional rights and ordered the institution to make immediate improvements or close entirely. His opinion included language that laid bare the horror of what Pennsylvania had created. Pennhurst is not a school. It is not a hospital. It is a place where the retarded are warehoused and forgotten. The conditions are so inhumane that they shock the conscience. Resistance and delay. You might think that a federal court order would have ended Pennhurst's operation immediately. You would be wrong. Pennsylvania fought the ruling every step of the way. They appealed to higher courts, arguing that states had the right to manage their own institutions without federal interference. They delayed implementation of court-ordered improvements, claiming they needed time to plan and budget. Meanwhile, residents continued suffering under the same horrific conditions that had been declared unconstitutional. The legal battle dragged on for years, with Pennsylvania using every procedural tool available to avoid closing Pennhurst or making meaningful changes. It took until 1987, nearly 20 years after Baldini's exposé and 10 years after the initial court ruling, for Pennhurst to finally close its doors. Even then, the closure wasn't complete vindication for the victims. Pennsylvania negotiated a deal that limited its financial liability. No criminal charges were filed against administrators or staff who had participated in the abuse. No comprehensive investigation was conducted into the deaths that had occurred over the decades. Pennhurst simply ceased operations, its residents moved to other facilities or community placements, its buildings abandoned, its history swept under the rug.
Aftermath and consequences. The scattered survivors. When Pennhurst closed in 1987, approximately 1,200 residents remained. These people, many of whom had spent decades or their entire lives at the institution, were suddenly thrust into a world they didn't understand. Some were moved to smaller state facilities or group homes. Others were placed with families who often weren't equipped to handle the severe trauma and behavioral issues that decades of abuse had created. Many former residents struggled to adapt to freedom. They have been institutionalized for so long that making choices, forming relationships, and living independently were completely foreign concepts. The psychological damage was profound and permanent. Former residents suffered from PTSD, attachment disorders, trust issues, and complex trauma that no amount of therapy could fully address. Some thrived after leaving Pennhurst, discovering abilities and potential that had been suppressed by institutional life. They learned to live independently, formed families, and advocated for disability rights. But others never recovered. They moved from institution to institution, unable to function in less restrictive settings because Pennhurst had destroyed their capacity for normalcy. Some died within years of leaving Pennhurst, their bodies and spirits broken beyond repair. Justice denied. Despite overwhelming evidence of systematic abuse, torture, and negligent homicide, no one was ever criminally prosecuted for what happened at Pennhurst. The state of Pennsylvania paid financial settlements to some former residents, but the amounts were relatively small and came with non-disclosure agreements that prevented victims from speaking publicly about their experiences. Staff members who had participated in abuse simply moved on to other jobs. Administrators who had overseen the horror retired with full pensions. State officials who had ignored decades of warnings faced no consequences. The cemetery where hundreds of Pennhurst residents were buried in unmarked graves remains poorly maintained and rarely visited. Plans to create a memorial have been repeatedly delayed or underfunded. In death, as in life, Pennhurst victims remain largely forgotten. The Pennhurst Haunted House. Exploitation continues. Perhaps the most obscene chapter in Pennhurst's post-closure history is what happened to the buildings. After sitting abandoned for years, the Pennhurst property was repurposed as a haunted attraction. Tourists pay to walk through the buildings where real people suffered real torture, treating the site as entertainment. The attraction markets itself using the trauma of former residents, advertising features like the Mayflower Building, where the most violent patients lived, and the isolation rooms where screams echoed. Disability rights advocates have protested this commodification of suffering, arguing that turning a site of systematic human rights violations into a Halloween attraction is deeply disrespectful to victims. But the attractions continue, generating profit from the pain of people who can't consent to having their trauma used as entertainment. It's a fitting final insult in a story defined by the exploitation of vulnerable people. Legislative change. The Pennhurst case did lead to important legal reforms. The litigation established precedents for disability rights and helped shape federal legislation, including the Americans with Disabilities Act. It demonstrated that institutionalization of people with intellectual disabilities was not only ineffective, but actively harmful. It showed that community-based care was both more humane and more effective at helping people with disabilities reach their potential. These legal victories have improved lives for millions of people with disabilities. But they came too late for the thousands who suffered and died at Pennhurst. Pennsylvania's reckoning that never came. To this day, Pennsylvania has never formally apologized for Pennhurst. State officials occasionally acknowledge that mistakes were made or that standards were different then. But these tepid admissions fall short of taking responsibility for 79 years of systematic torture. There has been no truth and reconciliation process, no comprehensive investigation into what happened and who was responsible, no real accountability for one of the worst institutional abuse cases in American history. The state would rather forget Pennhurst than confront it. And that choice to forget is itself a continuation of the dehumanization that created Pennhurst. Philosophical reflection. The Pennhurst within. Pennhurst didn't exist in a vacuum. It was created by a society that decided some lives were less valuable than others. And that society was us. The eugenic ideology that built Pennhurst wasn't a fringe belief. It was mainstream science, taught at prestigious universities, promoted by respected intellectuals, embraced by political leaders across the ideological spectrum. The people who designed Pennhurst believed they were serving the greater good. They thought they were protecting society from the threat of feeble-mindedness. And they convinced themselves that warehousing and sterilizing people with disabilities was compassionate because it prevented those people from reproducing and creating more suffering. This is how evil operates, not through obvious cruelty, but through rationalization and systematization, through the creation of categories that define some people as less than human. The parallels to Willowbrook. As we discussed in our episode about Willowbrook State School, the parallels between these institutions are striking and disturbing. Both opened in the early to mid-20th century with promises of progressive care. Both quickly became overcrowded warehouses of suffering. Both operated for decades while systematically abusing residents. Both fought closure despite court orders. But Pennhurst operated twice as long as Willowbrook, nearly 80 years compared to 40. That means 2 generations of people with disabilities were fed into Pennhurst's machinery of torture, while previous exposés and reforms had already revealed how destructive such institutions were. Willowbrook's hepatitis experiments at least had the veneer of scientific purpose, however unethical. Pennhurst didn't even have that. It was simply a place to warehouse people that society wanted to forget, with no purpose beyond containment. The similarities between these institutions reveal a disturbing truth. Pennhurst and Willowbrook weren't aberrations. They were part of a national system of institutionalized abuse. Nearly every state had similar facilities where people with disabilities were hidden away and subjected to neglect and torture. The question of progress. We like to tell ourselves that we've progressed beyond the thinking that created Pennhurst, that we no longer view people with disabilities as less than human, that we would never allow such systematic abuse to occur today. But have we really changed, or have we just gotten better at hiding our dehumanization? We still segregate people with disabilities in many contexts. We still underfund services and supports. We still pay caregivers poverty wages that make quality care nearly impossible. We still institutionalize people with disabilities at higher rates than other developed nations. The buildings might be smaller and have nicer names, but the underlying assumption often remains that people with disabilities are problems to be managed, rather than human beings deserving of dignity, autonomy, and inclusion.
When disability services are cut during budget crises, we accept it. When news reports reveal abuse at group homes or institutions, we express brief outrage and then move on. When people with disabilities are killed by caregivers or police, we often blame the victims rather than examine the systems that created the conditions for violence. The complicity of silence. Pennhurst operated for 79 years. That's not a failure of oversight. That's a choice. Thousands of people worked at Pennhurst over those decades. Hundreds of state officials visited and inspected the facility. Countless families dropped off their disabled relatives and never asked too many questions about their care. All of these people chose silence. They chose not to see, not to ask, not to demand change. And that collective silence allowed the torture to continue. But before we judge them too harshly, we should ask, what are we choosing not to see today? What systematic abuses are we ignoring because confronting them would be uncomfortable or inconvenient? The people who allowed Pennhurst to exist weren't monsters. They were ordinary people who convinced themselves that the suffering of disabled people wasn't their responsibility. They were us, in different circumstances. The value of a human life. At the core of Pennhurst's horror is a simple question: what is a human life worth? The people who created and maintained Pennhurst had answered that question clearly. Some lives are less valuable than others. People with intellectual disabilities were worth the cost of minimal containment, but not the cost of dignity, education, or genuine care. This wasn't an abstract philosophical position. It was translated into concrete policies: how much to spend on food, how many staff to hire, what conditions were acceptable, which deaths required investigation. Every budget decision reflected a judgment about the value of the lives affected by it, and every year Pennsylvania's budget communicated clearly that people with disabilities at Pennhurst were worth very little. This is the arithmetic of evil. Not dramatic cruelty, but bureaucratic choices that systematically devalue human life. Pennhurst operated for 79 years, 29,235 days of torture, hidden in plain sight, funded by taxpayer dollars, overseen by elected officials. During that time, thousands of people suffered. Hundreds died. Generations of families were told their disabled children would receive care and education, only to discover they had consigned them to hell. And for most of those 79 years, society didn't care, didn't ask questions, didn't demand accountability. It took a journalist with a camera to finally force the public to see what had always been there. But even then, it took another 19 years to close the facility, and no one was ever held criminally responsible. The buildings that housed Pennhurst still stand. Some have been converted to other uses, others sit abandoned, slowly deteriorating. And one section has been turned into a haunted house attraction where people pay money to be scared by fake monsters in a place where real monsters once tortured real people. This final indignity, the commodification of suffering for entertainment profit, seems almost fitting. It's a perfect metaphor for how society has always treated Pennhurst's victims, as objects to be used and discarded, never as human beings deserving of dignity and respect. The story of Pennhurst is often framed as historical tragedy, something that happened in the past when people didn't know better, when standards were different. But that framing is a lie we tell ourselves to avoid uncomfortable truths. People knew better. Standards for human decency existed. The suffering at Pennhurst was visible to anyone who chose to look. The problem wasn't ignorance, it was indifference, a societal decision that the lives of people with disabilities weren't valuable enough to justify the cost and effort of treating them humanely. And if we're honest, that indifference hasn't disappeared. It's just found new forms, new rationalizations, new ways to hide in plain sight. So here's the question that should haunt you. What is the Pennhurst of our time? What systematic abuse is happening right now, visible to anyone who chooses to look, that we're collectively ignoring because confronting it would be uncomfortable or expensive? Is it the treatment of people with disabilities in understaffed and underfunded group homes? The abuse of elderly people in nursing facilities? The conditions in prisons and detention centers? The neglect of homeless people with mental illness? Or is it something else entirely? Some form of dehumanization we don't even recognize because we're too embedded in the systems that perpetuate it. Pennhurst's victims deserve to be remembered, not as statistics or case studies, but as human beings who suffered unimaginable horror and received no justice. They deserve our rage at what was done to them. They deserve our commitment to ensuring nothing like Pennhurst ever happens again. And they deserve our willingness to confront the uncomfortable truth that the society that created Pennhurst is the same society we inherited. And most importantly, they deserve our determination to see and address the forms of systematic dehumanization that continue today, even when seeing them is uncomfortable and addressing them is difficult. Tell us in the comments, did you know about Pennhurst before watching this video? And knowing what you now know, what modern institutions or systems do you think we're ignoring today that future generations will judge us for? If this story has opened your eyes to the capacity for systematic evil hiding behind institutional walls, subscribe to Dreaded, because we're going to keep exposing the uncomfortable truths that society would rather forget. We've already shown you Willowbrook's hepatitis experiments that deliberately infected disabled children with disease. Now you've seen Pennhurst's 79-year reign of terror. But there are more stories, more institutions, more systematic abuses that need to be dragged into the light. The 29,235 days of torture at Pennhurst must be remembered. Not because remembering is comfortable, but because forgetting is complicity. The children who were caged, the adults who were restrained, the thousands who died in unmarked graves, they all deserved better than what Pennsylvania gave them, and they deserve better than to be forgotten now. Don't let their suffering be meaningless. Don't let their deaths be in vain. Use their stories to build the awareness and moral courage needed to see and stop the systematic dehumanization happening today. Because somewhere, right now, someone is suffering in an institution that society chooses not to see. Someone is being abused in a facility that promises care. Someone is dying in a place that was supposed to protect them. And our silence, our choice not to look, not to ask, not to demand accountability, makes us complicit. Pennhurst didn't happen because bad people did bad things. It happened because ordinary people chose not to see, not to care, and not to act. Don't be one of those people. Subscribe to Dreaded, share this video, demand accountability, question the institutions around you, and never, ever accept the premise that some human lives are worth less than others. Because that premise, that simple, terrible idea, is what created Pennhurst. And it's what will create the next Pennhurst if we let it. The choice is yours.